They were offered the kind of money WNBA players have publicly demanded for years, and they still said no. Not a rumor. Not a leak taken out of context. An actual deal on the table that would have pushed contracts into territory this league has never consistently seen before. And instead of celebrating it, instead of locking it in and moving forward, the Players Association slammed the brakes and turned it into a full-blown standoff. But here's where things get uncomfortable, because the real story isn't about the number on the contract. It's about what happened when the players finally got what they asked for, and suddenly realized they weren't nearly as united as they claimed. For months, the messaging was airtight. Public statements, social media posts, carefully worded interviews. We're on the same page. We stand together. We won't budge. It sounded powerful. It sounded organized. It sounded like leverage. Until the moment they walked into a room with the people who actually control the checks. Because the second that door closed, the energy changed. The confidence faded. And what was supposed to be a breakthrough meeting turned into something else entirely, a reality check. The owners didn't raise their voices. They didn't posture. They didn't play the public relations game. They just listened, and then said no. No to the numbers. No to the structure. No to the framing. And most importantly, no to the assumption that the players actually held the upper hand. That's when the cracks started to show. Not between owners and players, but between the players themselves. Because once real money is on the line, once timelines get tight, once missing a season stops being theoretical and starts becoming personal, unity gets tested fast. And for a lot of players in this league, that test hits very differently depending on who you are, how much you make, and how many backup options you have. Some players can afford to gamble. Most can't. And that's the part fans are starting to notice. Because while the league finally has momentum, new viewers, new stars, new attention, this fight is starting to look less like a stand for fairness and more like a risky power play that could blow everything up at the worst possible moment. And the meeting that exposed all of this? That's where the Real story begins. Because what happened behind those closed doors wasn't a negotiation. It was a bluff getting called. And it didn't go the way the players expected. But before you decide who's right and who's wrong, you need to understand exactly how this meeting came together and why it backfired almost immediately. This wasn't some routine check-in. This wasn't a let's feel things out conversation. This meeting had been building for weeks, quietly gaining pressure behind the scenes while fans argued online and headlines kept spinning the same talking points over and over again. The Players Association wanted something very specific, not just better terms, but a different power dynamic. They didn't want intermediaries. They didn't want delays. They didn't want to hear about future projections or long-term planning. They wanted ownership in the room. They wanted to bypass the commissioner. They wanted to bypass the usual channels. They wanted face-to-face access to the people who actually decide where the money goes. And to be fair, from the outside, it made sense. Ratings were up. Attendance was up. Merch sales were climbing. New stars had pulled in casual fans who'd never watched a WNBA game before. From the players' perspective, this felt like the moment to press. The perfect timing. Maximum leverage. Strike authorization in their pocket. Public sympathy on their side. So when that meeting was finally scheduled, it was framed as a win before it even happened. This is what we've been asking for. This is where things finally change. This is where we make history. But history doesn't always break the way people expect. Because when the owners walked in, they didn't act like a group under siege. They didn't act defensive. They didn't act desperate to keep the peace or worried about optics. They acted like people who had already run the numbers and didn't like what they saw. From the start, the tone was different than the players anticipated. There was no dramatic back and forth. No long philosophical debate about fairness or growth or symbolism. Just clarity. The proposals were laid out. The demands were heard. And then the response came back blunt and immediate. That salary cap jump? Not happening. That revenue share model? Not happening. That version of the future? Not happening. And according to multiple reports, the message wasn't sugar-coated. It wasn't softened for morale. It wasn't dressed up for social media later. It was essentially this. If this is what you came here with, you wasted your time. That line alone tells you how far apart the two sides actually were. Because the players walked into that room believing they were negotiating details. The owners walked in knowing they were shutting down a framework. That's a massive misread. And when that happens in a high-stakes negotiation, Everything after it becomes damage control. Here's why this matters. The players believed that getting owners in the room would force compromise. They believed ownership would blink under pressure. Pressure from fans, pressure from media, pressure from the momentum the league finally has. But the owners weren't negotiating based on vibes or headlines. They were negotiating based on balance sheets, long-term obligations, expansion costs, and financial risk. And they weren't willing to lock themselves into a structure that could put franchises hundreds of millions in the hole just to satisfy demands built on projected growth rather than current reality. That disconnect is the heart of this entire conflict. The players are negotiating based on what the league could be. The owners are negotiating based on what the league is right now. And when those two worldviews collide, somebody leaves unhappy. In this case, it was the players. Because walking out of that meeting, there was no victory lap. No optimistic press briefing. No "we made progress" talking points. There was silence. And silence after a big meeting like that doesn't mean strategy. It means shock. When negotiations go well, people rush to frame the narrative. They leak good news. They reassure supporters. They control the story. When negotiations go badly, everyone suddenly has no comment. That's exactly what happened here. And almost immediately after, something even more damaging leaked out. Not about the owners, but about the players. Reports started surfacing that the union wasn't nearly as unified as it had claimed. That behind closed doors, there were serious disagreements. That the executive committee itself wasn't on the same page. Some wanted to push harder. Some wanted to strike. Some wanted to lock in the deal and get paid. And the owners? They knew it. That's the part fans don't always see, but ownership always does. They understand incentives. They understand pressure. And they understand that a strike only works if the majority of players are willing to sit out and take zero income to prove a point. And once it became clear that many players weren't actually willing to do that, the leverage shifted instantly. That's why the owners didn't panic. That's why they drew a hard line. That's why this meeting wasn't a negotiation. It was a test. And the players failed it. Because the moment unity cracks, everything else collapses right after. And that leads directly to the most uncomfortable question in this entire situation. The money that's already on the table, and why turning it down is dividing the league faster than any owner ever could. And that's where this story really starts to get ugly. The biggest mistake the players made wasn't asking for more money. It was asking for everything at once, at the exact moment the league finally has momentum, and assuming the owners would cave because of public pressure. From the players' side, the logic sounded clean. Ratings were up. Arenas were fuller than they'd ever been. Jersey sales were exploding. Social media engagement was climbing. New fans were pouring in off the backs of a small group of stars. So the thinking went like this. If the league is growing, we deserve a bigger cut. And not later now. That's how you end up walking into a room demanding a massive jump in the salary cap and a fundamentally different revenue-sharing structure, all wrapped into one proposal. On paper, it looks bold. In practice, it looks reckless. Because the owners weren't just evaluating whether players deserve more. They were evaluating whether the demands made financial sense right now, not 5 years down the road. This is where the disconnect became impossible to ignore. The players framed their proposal around future growth. Projected media deals. Expected expansion fees. Hypothetical long-term popularity. The argument was basically, pay us today based on where this league is headed. The owner's response was simple. You don't get paid tomorrow's money today. That's not cruelty. That's how every business operates. The league may be growing, but it still isn't operating like a cash-printing machine. Costs are rising right alongside revenue. Expansion isn't free. Marketing isn't free. Travel isn't free. And locking in a revenue-sharing model that balloons obligations before profits are stable is how you cripple a league, not grow it. And that's exactly why the owners didn't negotiate around the edges. They shut it down. Because from their perspective, the players weren't asking for a raise. They were asking for structural control without absorbing any of the risk. And here's the part the players either ignored or underestimated. The owners weren't afraid of the optics. They knew fans would scream. They knew headlines would sound brutal. They knew social media would frame it as greed. They also knew something else. They knew the players couldn't stay unified long enough to force their hand. That's why the owners drew such a hard line so fast. It wasn't stubbornness, it was strategy. When someone overreaches in a negotiation, the worst thing you can do is compromise early. You let them feel the wall. You let reality sink in. You wait for internal pressure to do the work for you. And internal pressure is exactly what started building the second details of that proposal leaked. Because once people realized how aggressive the demands were, the conversation inside locker rooms started shifting. Not everyone heard historic opportunity. Some heard, we're about to risk everything. And that's when the questions stopped being philosophical and started being personal. Because while fans argue about fairness and revenue percentages, players are doing math. Very simple math. 5 months of work for hundreds of thousands of dollars versus zero income while hoping everyone else holds the line. That calculation doesn't hit stars and role players the same way. And the owners understood that perfectly. They knew that the more time passed, the more those conversations would spread. Quietly at first, then openly, then bitterly. Because once players start asking, what happens if this drags on? Unity evaporates fast. The players thought the demand itself would scare ownership into compromise. Instead, it revealed how exposed the union really was. And the worst part, the owners didn't even have to say it out loud. They just let the silence do the work. No counteroffer wrapped in hope. No symbolic concession. No vague promise of revisiting later. Just a clear rejection, which forced the players to confront something they hadn't planned for. What if the owners don't blink? What if the league calls your bluff? What if the only leverage you thought you had turns out to be imaginary? Because the moment that reality sets in, a union stops being a movement and starts being a collection of individuals with very different priorities. And that brings us to the issue that's tearing this whole thing apart faster than any owner ever could. The money that's already on the table, and why rejecting it might be the most divisive move the players could have made. Because once you understand that number, everything about this fight changes. And that's coming next. The owners didn't win this negotiation by overpowering the players. They won it by waiting. That's the part most fans miss. There was no dramatic showdown. No fiery speeches. No threats thrown across the table. The owners didn't need to flex, because they already knew something the players were still pretending wasn't true. They knew the threat of a strike only works if everyone is willing to suffer together. And they knew that wasn't actually the case. From the moment the Players Association authorized a strike, the messaging was loud and confident. It was framed as a sign of unity, as proof that the league's players were finally ready to draw a line in the sand. But authorizing a strike and surviving a strike are two very different things. The owners understood that better than anyone in the room. They've seen it before in other leagues. They've watched unions fracture when checks stop coming. They've watched players publicly posture while privately panicking. They've watched we're all in turn into, I just need to look out for my family. So instead of negotiating against a headline, they negotiated against human nature. That's why the owners didn't counter with some halfway compromise. That's why they didn't stretch the meeting out. That's why they didn't try to smooth things over. They looked at the proposal, recognized it as an overreach, and shut it down immediately. Because once you do that, the pressure shifts off you and onto the other side. Now the players have to explain why they walked away. Now the union has to manage expectations. Now individual players have to decide whether they're really willing to miss checks for a principle that might not even hold together. And almost instantly, that pressure started doing damage. Reports began surfacing about internal disagreements. Not just among role players, but inside the executive committee itself. The very group that was supposed to embody unity was suddenly split. Some members wanted to double down and push harder, believing that any retreat would permanently weaken the union's credibility. Others were quietly asking a different question. What if this is already a good deal? That split is fatal in negotiations. Because once the owners see it, they don't have to do anything else. Time becomes their ally. Every day without a deal chips away at the players' resolve. Every day without income sharpens priorities. And that's exactly what the owners are betting on. They know that the league's calendar doesn't stop. Training camps are scheduled. Rosters need to be finalized. Broadcast partners need certainty. Sponsors need clarity. Every delay creates chaos, but that chaos hurts players more than owners. Owners can wait. Players have bills. That imbalance is the quiet weapon in this whole situation. And it's why the owners never panicked when the players went public. They understood that public pressure fades faster than private stress. Fans might stay angry for a while. Social media might keep trending. But eventually, the conversation moves on. Meanwhile, players are still waking up without paychecks. And that's when bluff meets reality. Because once even a small percentage of players start thinking about crossing the line, the strike collapses. You don't need everyone to break ranks. You just need enough to make unity look fake. The owners know that. The players know that. And now fans are starting to see it too. The meeting wasn't about reaching an agreement. It was about forcing a choice. And the owners made it clear they weren't going to flinch first. Which leaves the players in an impossible position. If they cave, they look weak. If they strike, they risk everything. And if they fracture, they lose all leverage permanently. That's why this moment feels different from past labor fights. Because this isn't owners versus players anymore. It's players versus themselves. And that internal conflict becomes even harder to ignore when you look at the number everyone keeps dancing around, the actual contracts being discussed. Because once you understand what some players are being asked to turn down, the anger from fans starts to make sense. And that's exactly where this story goes next. For months, the Players Association sold one message above all else: unity. Every public statement leaned on it. Every interview echoed it. Every social media post reinforced it. The idea was simple. When ownership looks across the table, they see one voice, one plan, one unbreakable front. That image was the union's biggest weapon. And the moment it cracked, everything else became fragile. Because what fans didn't see, until now, was how different the conversations sounded once the cameras were gone and the doors were closed. Inside the union, there were two completely different interpretations of what this moment meant. One side saw the league's momentum as proof that now was the time to push as hard as possible. They believed that if the players didn't demand everything they wanted right now, they'd never get another chance like this. From their perspective, compromise wasn't strategy, it was surrender. The other side saw something else entirely. They saw risk. They saw a league that was growing but still fragile. They saw momentum that could disappear as fast as it arrived. And they saw an offer on the table that, while imperfect, represented real progress. Money most players in the league had never come close to earning before. That divide matters more than any headline. Because once negotiations move from ideology to income, priorities change fast. For some players, this fight is about legacy and leverage. For others, it's about stability and survival. And pretending those motivations are identical is how unions implode. What made this situation especially damaging is how quickly that internal conflict spilled into the open. Leaks started appearing almost immediately after the meeting. Reports describing debates inside the executive committee itself. Not whispers from the bottom of the roster, but disagreement at the very top. That's catastrophic in a labor fight. Because the moment owners see division at the leadership level, they know they don't have to rush. They don't have to sweeten the deal. They don't have to negotiate against a unified force. They can just wait. And waiting is exactly what they're doing. Meanwhile, the union has to manage something far harder than negotiations: expectations. Players were told this was the moment. That leverage was at its peak. That the owners would have no choice but to bend. Now they're being asked to accept that the owners didn't bend at all. That creates anger. That creates confusion. That creates resentment. And resentment inside a union is deadly. Because once players start questioning leadership, everything else unravels. Every update gets scrutinized. Every delay feels suspicious. Every compromise feels like betrayal. The phrase "we're all on the same page" stops sounding reassuring and starts sounding defensive. And fans can sense that shift. They're watching players argue online. They're watching mixed messages leak out. They're watching some players push strike rhetoric while others stay silent. Silence, in moments like this, speaks volumes. It suggests uncertainty. It suggests disagreement. It suggests fear. And fear is not leverage. The owners know that the longer this drags out, the harder it becomes for the union to maintain the illusion of unity. Because eventually, players stop thinking collectively and start thinking individually. What happens if this lasts into the season? What happens if camps are delayed? What happens if sponsors pull back? What happens if fans don't come back? Those questions don't hit everyone equally. And the union doesn't have a clean answer for them. That's why the meeting was such a turning point. Not because the owners said no, but because the players couldn't even agree on how to respond to it. And when a union can't agree on the next move, the fight is already half lost. Which brings us to the number that's making this divide impossible to hide. Because once money becomes real, not hypothetical, not future-focused, not symbolic. Unity becomes very expensive. And that's exactly what's happening right now. This is the moment where the entire argument shifts. Because once real numbers enter the conversation, not projections, not principles, not future visions, everything suddenly becomes uncomfortable. The deal being discussed isn't symbolic money. It isn't exposure. It isn't promises. It's contracts in the $400,000 to $500,000 range for top-tier players. In a league where most careers are short, salaries have historically been modest, and financial security has never been guaranteed, that number isn't just good, it's life-changing. And that's exactly why this fight is tearing the players apart. For fans watching from the outside, rejecting that kind of money feels insane. For many players inside the league, it feels dangerous. And for the union leadership, it's become the issue they can't control. Because here's the truth no one wants to say publicly. Most WNBA players are not rich. Most WNBA players do not have million-dollar endorsement deals. Most WNBA players do not have equity in startups or alternative leagues. For them, a $400,000 contract isn't a negotiating chip, it's security. It's the difference between needing to play overseas in the off-season or staying home. It's the difference between stability and uncertainty. It's the difference between planning for the future and surviving season to season. So when players are asked to turn that down in the name of leverage, the question stops being ideological very quickly. It becomes personal. How long do we sit out? What happens if this doesn't work? Who's covering my expenses? What if the league doesn't bounce back? Those aren't selfish questions. They're real ones. And the more they get asked, the harder it becomes to maintain unity. Because while fans see one group called the players, the reality inside the league is far more stratified. There are stars, mid-tier players, role players, and fringe roster spots, all with wildly different financial realities. For a player at the top, missing a season is painful but survivable. For a player in the middle, it's terrifying. For a player fighting to stay in the league, it's catastrophic. That's why this number matters so much. It exposes the imbalance inside the union. When leadership frames rejecting the deal as standing strong, a lot of players hear something else entirely. You're being asked to sacrifice so someone else can push for more. And once that thought takes root, trust evaporates. Fans are reacting to this too. Because from the outside, it looks like players finally got a real bag and decided it wasn't enough. Not because it wasn't fair, but because it didn't satisfy the most aggressive voices in the room. That perception is brutal. It flips the narrative from fighting for equality to overplaying your hand. And once fans start seeing it that way, sympathy drains fast. This is why comment sections have turned toxic. Why patience is wearing thin. Why people who were finally tuning in are suddenly questioning whether this league understands its own moment. Because momentum is fragile. And nothing kills momentum faster than internal chaos over money. The union tried to frame this as a collective stand for the future. But the future doesn't pay rent. The future doesn't cover medical bills. The future doesn't guarantee another contract. $400,000 does. And that's why this number isn't just a talking point, it's a fracture line. It forces players to confront something uncomfortable. Not everyone benefits equally from holding the line. And once that realization sets in, the entire power dynamic shifts. Because now the owners don't look like villains holding back progress. They look like the only side offering certainty in a situation spiraling toward risk. That doesn't mean the deal is perfect. It doesn't mean the players' concerns are invalid. But it does mean that rejecting this kind of money comes with consequences, especially when unity is already fragile. And here's where it gets even messier. Because some players don't just have the luxury of waiting, they have incentives to. And once you understand who they are and what they stand to gain, this entire standoff starts to look very different. This is the part of the story that makes everything else click. Because once you look at who can afford to wait and who can't, the entire negotiation suddenly stops looking like a collective fight and starts looking like a conflict of interest. Not all WNBA players live in the same financial universe. Some players have endorsements stacked on top of endorsements. Some have shoe deals, sponsorships, and off-court income that dwarfs their league salary. Some have equity stakes in alternative leagues, ownership positions, or guaranteed money flowing in whether the WNBA season happens or not. For those players, a strike isn't existential. It's strategic. Missing a season might even benefit them. More attention elsewhere, more leverage long-term, more control over the future. But that's not the reality for the majority of the league. Most players don't have that safety net. They don't have backup income that cushions a missed season. They don't have passive revenue rolling in while negotiations drag on. For them, sitting out isn't a tactic. It's a gamble with their livelihood. And that's where this fight becomes fundamentally uneven. Because the loudest voices pushing for maximum pressure aren't the ones most vulnerable to the fallout. They're insulated. They can afford patience. They can afford risk. Meanwhile, mid-tier players are quietly staring at a clock. Every week without a deal is a week closer to chaos. Training camps delayed. Rosters frozen. Career windows shrinking. And while leadership talks about principles, these players are thinking about reality. That disconnect breeds resentment fast. It creates a sense that some players are fighting for ideals while others are being asked to bankroll those ideals with their careers. And fans can see it. Because when a player with multiple income streams says hold the line, it lands very differently than when a role player hears it. That's why the union's messaging is losing power. Because unity only works when sacrifice is shared equally. And right now it isn't. The existence of alternative leagues and off-season opportunities has completely warped this negotiation. It's introduced incentives that didn't exist before. Incentives that reward delay, conflict, and disruption. If the WNBA season stalls, attention doesn't disappear, it shifts. And some players are positioned to benefit from that shift. Owners know this. They know exactly who stands to gain and who stands to lose. They know which players can wait and which players can't. That's why they're comfortable holding firm. Because every day that passes without a deal makes the internal imbalance more obvious. And the more obvious it becomes, the harder it is for the union to maintain solidarity. At some point, players start asking the question no union wants to hear. Who is this really for? Is it for the entire league? Or is it for a select group with the luxury to wait? That question doesn't get asked publicly, at least not yet. But it's already being whispered privately. And once those whispers turn into conversations, the strike threat collapses. Because a strike isn't just about willingness, it's about trust. Trust that leadership represents everyone. Trust that sacrifice will be shared. Trust that the end result will actually benefit the people paying the price. Right now, that trust is eroding. And that erosion is exactly what the owners are counting on. They don't need to convince players they're right. They just need to let the players convince themselves that this fight isn't worth it. Which brings us to the wild card in all of this. The alternative leagues circling this chaos like vultures. Because if the WNBA stumbles, someone else is ready to fill the void. And that possibility is quietly reshaping everything. This is the subplot that makes owners nervous and quietly distorts everything the players think they're fighting for. Because while the WNBA and the Players Association are locked in this standoff, there's another group watching very closely and smiling. Alternative leagues don't need the WNBA to fail forever. They just need it to stumble. They need confusion. They need uncertainty. They need talent looking for stability somewhere else. And a stalled season is the perfect opening. These leagues sell something seductive to players: flexibility, ownership, equity, control. Not just salaries, but the promise of being part of something new, something that feels less rigid, less hierarchical, less bound by traditional power structures. For players frustrated with the WNBA's pace of change, that pitch lands hard. And here's the dangerous part. If the WNBA goes dark, even temporarily, attention doesn't vanish. Fans don't stop watching basketball. Media doesn't stop covering the sport. It just shifts. And once it shifts, getting it back isn't guaranteed. Owners understand this risk. That's why they're cautious. That's why they're not rushing into structural commitments they can't reverse. But players are misreading that caution as weakness. They think owners are afraid of losing momentum. And they are, but not in the way the players assume. The owners aren't afraid of bad press. They're afraid of locking in a model that could permanently destabilize the league if growth slows or stalls. They know that alternative leagues don't have to sustain themselves long-term to cause damage. They just have to siphon attention, talent, and narrative at the right moment. And here's where the players get trapped. Because the same alternative leagues being framed as leverage are also undermining the players' unity. They create different incentives for different people. They blur loyalties. They reward disruption. For some players, chaos is opportunity. For others, it's a threat. And unions cannot survive when incentives pull members in opposite directions. The more this standoff drags on, the more alternative leagues become part of the calculation, whether players admit it or not. Some start viewing a delayed season as a chance to explore other options. Others see it as a risk that could push them out of the league entirely. That divergence weakens collective action. Owners know that if players have escape hatches, they're less likely to endure sustained pressure. And if players don't have escape hatches, they're less likely to strike. Either way, the strike threat loses power. That's why owners are comfortable holding the line. They're not negotiating against a single entity. They're negotiating against a fragmented ecosystem with competing interests. And the longer the stalemate lasts, the more those interests pull apart. Which brings us to the turning point that fans are reacting to most strongly. Because while players argue strategy and leadership debates leverage, fans are looking at the calendar and losing patience. And once fans turn, momentum becomes incredibly hard to rebuild. This is where the mood around the league really starts to change. Because fans aren't sitting in negotiation rooms. They're not dissecting revenue models or long-term projections. They're reacting to what they can see, and what they're seeing right now doesn't feel like progress. For years, fans were told to wait. Wait for better coverage. Wait for better pay. Wait for better treatment. Wait for the league to catch up. And many of them did. They showed up. They watched games they never used to watch. They bought jerseys. They defended the league online. They argued with skeptics. They helped create the very momentum the players are now using as leverage. So when fans hear that players are rejecting contracts in the hundreds of thousands, the reaction isn't sympathy anymore. It's confusion, and then frustration. Because from the outside, it looks like the league finally found its moment, and instead of building on it, everyone is threatening to tear it down. Fans don't see nuance. They see headlines. They don't see internal debates. They see delays. They don't see strategy. They see dysfunction. And dysfunction kills goodwill fast. The narrative has shifted from players fighting for fairness to players fighting each other. And once that happens, public support evaporates. Fans are asking simple questions. Why now? Why risk the season? Why turn down money that most people will never see? Why gamble with momentum that took decades to build? Those questions don't have clean answers, and the longer they go unanswered, the more fans disengage. This is especially dangerous for a league that doesn't have generational loyalty yet. The WNBA's recent growth pulled in casual fans, not diehards. Casual fans don't wait around for labor disputes to resolve. They just leave. Owners know this risk. Players know it too, but they're betting that fans will side with them regardless. That's a risky bet, because fans don't align with ideology. They align with entertainment, with access, with consistency. When a league becomes a negotiation story instead of a basketball story, fans tune out. And once they tune out, they rarely rush back. That's why comment sections are getting harsher. Why tone has shifted from supportive to skeptical. Why phrases like greedy and out of touch are suddenly appearing in conversations that used to be defensive and protective. It's not that fans hate the players. It's that fans feel like the players are squandering the moment they helped create. And that emotional turn is devastating in a labor fight. Because public sympathy is leverage, and that leverage is slipping. The owners don't need fans to love them. They just need fans to stop caring enough to apply pressure. And right now, that's exactly what's happening. Which brings us to the most dangerous scenario of all. Because if this standoff leads to a strike, the consequences won't just be financial. They could reshape the league for years. And the players may not be the ones who come out ahead. On paper, a strike sounds powerful. It sounds like leverage. It sounds like unity. It sounds like players finally forcing ownership to listen. But in reality, a strike in a league like the WNBA isn't a flex, it's a stress test. And stress tests don't just reveal strength. They expose weaknesses. Fast. If a strike happens, the first thing to understand is this. It doesn't hurt everyone equally. Owners lose money, sure. But owners are built to absorb losses. They have diversified portfolios, long-term investments, and the ability to wait out bad quarters. For them, a strike is an inconvenience, not an existential threat. For players, it's the opposite. Missed games mean missed checks. Missed checks mean immediate pressure. Immediate pressure turns principles into problems. The idea that every player will hold the line for months is fantasy. It ignores reality. It ignores human behavior. It ignores the financial structure of this league. Because the moment the season is officially delayed, players start asking very specific questions. How long does this last? What happens if it goes into the summer? What happens if sponsors walk? What happens if my roster spot disappears? Those questions don't get answered in press releases. They get answered in private conversations, and those conversations don't stay aligned for long. A strike only works if the vast majority of players honor it. Not 90%, not 80%. It needs almost everyone. Because if even 20 or 30% decide they'd rather play than sit, the strike collapses. Owners don't even need to fight it, they just wait for it to fall apart. And when a strike collapses, the consequences are brutal. The union loses credibility. Leadership loses trust. Future negotiations become harder, not easier. Players who cross lines get blamed. Players who held firm feel betrayed. Locker rooms fracture. And once a union fractures publicly, it never fully recovers. This is what the players are staring down. Not just the risk of losing a season, but the risk of permanently weakening their collective power. And the irony is painful. The league has more attention right now than it has ever had. New fans, new stars, new media interest. This should be a consolidation moment, a time to lock in gains and build forward. A strike flips that story completely. It turns growth into chaos. It turns opportunity into uncertainty. It turns excitement into exhaustion. Casual fans won't wait it out. They'll move on. Media will shift focus. Alternative leagues will fill the void. And when the WNBA comes back, if it comes back smoothly, it may not find the same audience waiting. That's not speculation. That's history. Labor disputes don't just pause momentum. They break it. And the most dangerous part? The players would be taking this risk without even being unified about it. That's not a strategy. That's a gamble. And the owners know it. That's why they're holding firm. That's why they're letting time do the work. That's why they're forcing the players to make a choice instead of negotiating endlessly. Take the deal, or roll the dice. Because the longer this drags on, the less control the players actually have. And that brings us to the final moment of truth. The choice in front of the players now, and why whatever they decide will define this league's future far more than any contract number ever could. This is the moment where all the talking stops. No more posturing. No more carefully worded statements. No more pretending time isn't running out. Because whether the players want to admit it or not, the owners have already forced the decision. There are only two paths left. Take the deal or strike. And neither one is clean. If the players take the deal, they secure the biggest financial leap the league has ever seen. They lock in stability. They protect the season. They preserve momentum. But they also have to swallow the reality that they overplayed their hand, that this wasn't the moment to demand everything at once. That's a hard pill to swallow for leadership, because it means admitting that the unity narrative cracked under pressure. It means admitting that the owners weren't bluffing. And it means explaining to the loudest voices why compromise isn't betrayal. But if the players strike, they risk everything. They risk fracturing the union permanently. They risk losing casual fans who finally showed up. They risk turning a growth story into a labor dispute story. They risk handing attention to alternative leagues that are more than happy to take it. And worst of all, they risk discovering that not everyone is willing to sacrifice the same amount for the same goal. Because once checks stop coming, principles get tested fast. That's the reality nobody wants to say out loud. The owners aren't forcing this choice because they're cruel. They're forcing it because they know the players can't stay unified under sustained pressure. They're betting that fear beats ideology. They're betting that most players will choose certainty over chaos. And based on everything that's leaked so far, they might be right. The players thought they were negotiating from strength. They thought record ratings gave them leverage. They thought public pressure would force ownership to blink. Instead, ownership exposed the cracks, waited them out, and put the decision right back in the players' hands. No spin. No safety net. No more delays. And that's why this moment feels so heavy. Because whatever happens next will define the league for years. If the players accept the deal, this becomes a lesson in overreach. A reminder that timing matters just as much as momentum. If they strike and fracture, this becomes a cautionary tale about how quickly opportunity can slip away when unity is more performative than real. Either way, the illusion is gone. The meeting that was supposed to change everything didn't empower the players. It exposed them. It showed who could afford to wait and who couldn't. It showed whose voices carried weight and whose were drowned out. It showed that leverage isn't about headlines, It's about cohesion. And right now, cohesion is exactly what's missing. So the real question isn't whether the players deserve more money. The question is whether they're willing to risk the entire league to get it. Because the owners have made their position clear. They're not blinking. They're not chasing approval. They're not negotiating against a divided front. The clock is ticking. And very soon, the players will have to decide whether this moment becomes a turning point or the beginning of a setback they can't undo. This story is moving fast, and the next decision changes everything. The season, the union, and the future of the league. So I want to know what you think. Do the players take the deal and protect the momentum? Or do they strike and risk blowing it all up? Drop your prediction in the comments, because we're about to find out who was bluffing and who wasn't. And make sure you subscribe right now, because this situation is evolving by the day. Leaks are already coming out, and I'll be covering every major twist as it happens. This isn't over. Not even close.